Hi, everyone. So happy to see where everyone is coming from across the world. And it's a real honor to be able to be here today and to present our speaker. My name is Megan Bedell, and I'm the acquisitions editor for Corwin's Equity and Professional Learning line. And today we have with you the highly esteemed Dr. Tyrone Howard. And Dr. Howard is one of the nation's foremost thinkers and change agents on issues tied to inequities in education. He is a Pritzker Family Endowed Chair in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA, as well as the co-director of the Pritzker Center for Strengthening Children and Families. He's also the co-director of the UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools. Dr. Howard has published over 100 scholarly journal articles, book chapters, policy briefs, and technical reports, and he is the author of 6 books, and his latest is Equity Now, which was released with Corwin last month. Dr. Howard is a president and a fellow of AERA, the world's largest educational research organization. And in 2021, Dr. Howard was elected as a member of the National Academy of Education. His work has been highlighted by the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post, and he's regularly featured on National Public Radio, and many other media outlets. But for this next hour this afternoon, we're honored to have him as our guest for our Monday Corwin webinar series. And I'm going to turn it over to Tyrone.
Thank you so much, Megan. I had to get my time straight when you said Monday morning, Monday
Yeah.
morning, Monday afternoon. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your schedules to be a part of our conversation. I like to think of it as a sit and learn, sit and get. But I want to just say how excited I am about the opportunity to work with Corwin on this book around Equity Now. And I'm going to talk about some of the sort of the rationale behind the writing of the book and get into some of the details of the book. And I hope you will find it useful enough that you will go out and get a copy or 2 or 3. I framed this book title came about because there has been a lot of conversation in the last 10, 15 years around equity. And I was always intrigued by the fact that when you'd ask folks what their definition of was equity, you would get different definitions. Ask 5 different people, you get 5 different definitions. And so I wanted to try to bring some clarity to what this term equity meant and why we should try to be on the same page as we think about it as we do this work. But I was also moved by what I saw happening, like I know all of you saw happening over the course of the pandemic. And that is, we saw closures of schools, we saw young people, students being disconnected from traditional learning opportunities, and we saw gaps get even wider. And so it really, to me, suggested we needed a more urgency, sort of a more urgent sense in how we thought about this concept of equity. So I took these 2 desires, this desire 1 to bring clarity around how we think about equity, coupled with this need to act with expediency, because we were seeing so many young people falling further and further behind, and hence this term equity now. And I have been sort of playing with this catchphrase that if not now, when? What are we waiting for? Why are we delaying? How can we act sooner to act on behalf of all of our students, but in particular those who are most vulnerable? And that's one of the big foci of this work, is thinking about justice, repair, and belonging in schools. And I'll talk about that in a second. I always start each of my talks with a sincere notion of gratitude for everybody who's in this work. No matter what your role might be, you might be a parent and or a caregiver, you might be a classroom teacher, you might be a paraprofessional, you might be a counselor, you might be a school district administrator, you may be a principal, assistant principal. No matter what your role is in the education of our young people, you play a vital part of this process. So I want to say thank you. We are a community of individuals who want to see schools work for all of our students. And I think sometimes folks get a bad rap, or they're oftentimes criticized unfairly for not doing this, that, and the other. But I want to say that we have to take time to create the kind of spaces that don't push people out, but that call people in. And I think one of the ways you call people in is by making sure that you are willing to offer the gratitude for folks doing what they do every single day on behalf of our most cherished possession, our children, to create the kind of schools and learning opportunities and environments that they are so worthy and deserving of. So just thank you for what you do. Thank you for your commitment. Thank you for your investment. Thank you for your time, effort, and energy into the education of young people. And as I talk with you today, please feel free to put questions in the chat because I don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to try to cover a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. And so if there's a need to hear me elaborate on something a little bit more in detail, please feel free to do so, because I think the Q&A is oftentimes one of the more enriching parts of these processes. So let's get started. So to start this conversation on equity, I think we have to make a fundamental shift in terms of the kinds of environments that we create. And I say this in the book, we have to make a shift away from safe spaces to brave spaces, because equity is not for the faint of heart. Equity is not for the thin skin. Equity is not for those who are easily rattled. And I think what happens in schools sometimes is we play safe space more than we should. We play too nice. And I think there's a bold fundamental shift we have to have if we're going to first talk about equity, but then secondly, do the work of equity. When we talk about safe spaces, I think what we create are cordial, respectful, and congenial workplaces, which are vital, which are important, but they don't get us to have those really hard, courageous conversations. And I think brave spaces do something different. They are respectful, but they're challenging at times, where we can be disagreeable without being disrespectful. In safe spaces, we tend to avoid confrontation. We don't want to upset the apple cart. We don't want to ruffle feathers. And I maintain that for brave spaces, we have to encourage respectful differences of opinion. We're talking about educating young people, and we don't always see eye to eye. And if we're going to do equity work, we have to be okay at times saying, I fundamentally and vehemently disagree with that particular practice or that particular policy or what you've just said about a particular family. In safe spaces, we tend to evade the difficult conversations because, again, we play nice. We don't want to have the hard conversations. And I ask that if we are using brave spaces, we lean into difficult conversations. We want them because that's when we really start to get to the heart of why we see some of what we see happening in our schools. So don't run from the hard conversation. We have to take it head on, because if it is hard for us to have these conversations about some of our students, how do we think it feels for them to live what they live in our schools every single day? So the adults have to be willing to be brave and courageous enough to have these conversations. And in safe spaces, comfort of adults is the priority. Let's make the adults feel safe. Let's make the adults feel at ease. And I think in brave spaces, we recognize that discomfort creates opportunity for growth and transformation. And it also operates from the standpoint that we should never place adult comfort over students' well-being. I'll say that again. Sometimes we place adult comfort over what's in the best interest of our students. So I'm going to ask us to think long and hard about what it means to say, you know what, if I've got to be uncomfortable for my students to be comfortable, that should be a stance I'm willing to take as an educator. And here in safe spaces, the goal is ultimately support for everyone, which is important and necessary. But for the brave spaces, the goal is to create equitable spaces for everybody, our students first and foremost, but then also for all of our education personnel. So as you think about this work, many of you I know who are listening, know that you sit in meetings and you hear your colleagues say things that are oftentimes disrespectful, uncomfortable, at times racist, sexist, homophobic, or say things that are really just inappropriate. I'm going to ask us to lean into those brave spaces to start asking folks, what do they mean by that? And do they think those words or those phrases, or those terms can be hurtful and harmful? And what does that mean for educating students if you feel this way, or if you think this way, if you act this way? So to do the work of equity, the first fundamental point is to be willing to lean into brave spaces. So once we do that, I ask us to think about the following. To recognize that equality does not mean equity. I oftentimes hear these two terms used interchangeably, and it really it bothers me at times. Because what happens is that we tend to think that they're both one and the same. I maintain that we want to create schools that are centered around equality, but I think we have to use equity as our mechanism to get to equality. We are not at the same place. And equity operates, and I talk about this in the book, from the standpoint that we do everything within our power to ensure that everybody is able to be met where they are. I'll say that again. We meet students where they are. So you see the safe space, brave space breakdown, the differences that are so critical in terms of understanding that. And I hope that kind of sort of serves as a framing for how we start the conversations. So I mentioned the fact that equality and equity are not the same. And it's important to understand that equality is our goal, but equity is our means of how we get there. But I think the work of equity, as I said a moment ago, is about recognizing that we have to understand that equality says give everyone the same thing because it assumes that everyone's at the same level. I maintain that we have to recognize that not everyone is at the same level, because if we use that sort of approach, we would continue to have disparities in outcomes across different student groups. Equity says in order to have everyone at the same level, you first have to look at and see if they have what they need to get there. What does that mean? That means that we have to recognize that some students show up at schools and they've not had anything to eat since the previous day's lunch. That means some students are experiencing homelessness and oftentimes have to spend time sleeping in cars or sleeping in shelters. Some students have disabilities that have not been diagnosed, and so therefore they need additional supports to be able to get them up to speed with where they are. Some students have spent years in schools that have not given them the proper academic supports, and they've fallen behind every year they've been in school, and they need additional time to get them where they need to be on grade level. And I could go on and on and on about the ways in which students show up every single day trying to be their best, but oftentimes the kinds of circumstances and situations that they have found themselves in puts them at a severe disadvantage. So equality would say, we'll give all students the same thing, and doesn't matter where they are, we can still say we're fair. Fair is not what we're talking about when we talk about equity. If we're talking about fair, we would say, well, guess what, folks? Poverty is not fair, but lots of students deal with that. Racism in schools is not fair, but a lot of students deal with that. So lots of things that happen in the context of schools that aren't fair. So we're not talking fair. We're talking about making sort of understanding of where we are and what is the reality. And equity says that, again, we have to see where people are and meet them there. Another way I like to think about it is I use in the book the racing metaphor. The racing metaphor is another way to think about equity because, again, equality operates from this standpoint that we all start at the same point. We're all at the same starting line. And so therefore, if you run a 100-yard dash, wherever you finish is basically based off of your own merit. And there's nothing further from the truth when we think about what happens in schools. What I like to think about when it comes to equity is that think about this 100-yard dash. Instead of all these racers being at the beginning of the starting line, let's say one of them got to move up to the 50-yard mark, and that's where she got to start. Let's say another one moved up to the 60-yard mark, and that's where she got to start. Let's say one of them had the opportunity of being at the 80-yard mark, and that's where she got to start, all in a 100-yard dash. But there were two others who were still here at the starting line. And then the starting gun goes off and they tell them to race. And obviously, we would think that the ones who had the biggest advantage and the biggest head start would finish first. And the ones who started all the way back at the original starting line, we look at them and say, why didn't they win? Why didn't they do better? And equity says we recognize that not everybody starts from the same place. Not everyone has the same advantages. Not everyone has the same opportunities. But what we would not say to these folks who are in this race, if they start at the starting line, we wouldn't say, you know what, you needed to run a little bit harder. You needed to pump those arms just a bit more. You needed to get those legs up, because if you had gotten those legs up and pumped those arms and got your form right, you would have won the race. Well, these folks were at a structural disadvantage from the outset. And that's what we're facing in schools. When we have generation after generation after generation of built-in advantages that some groups have had over others, equity says, how do we begin to take those matters into account as we respond to the reality? So continue to think about who are the student groups who have consistently had opportunities and advantages that others have not. That's how I think of equity. Not everyone starts from the same place. Not everyone has the same advantages. Not everyone is afforded the same opportunities. So I say that because we are in a very, I would say, curious point as a nation. And I'm one who studies demographics, race, culture, language, trends. And another reason why we have to study this and think about equity, because we're a changing nation. We're seeing unprecedented ethnic and racial demographic changes in our society. So if I started you off to say, let's look at where we were in the year 1900, 88% of our students were white. We're a mostly white country. So when we said minorities, we truly meant non-whites. Even as recently as 50 years ago in 1970, about 80% of our students were white, 20% of our students were of color. So again, when we talked about how schools were set up, whose culture, whose history, whose language was most prominent, it was typically that of white Americans. Students of color, people of color were not really sort of represented in curriculum and our sort of ways of how we celebrated the nation, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to take you to the school year 2016, 2017, because something happened in that year that was expected, but it happened sooner than what was anticipated because demographers, folks who study this, recognize it happened about 6 years sooner than anticipated. But the first year, in 2016, 2017, we enrolled more non-white kindergartners than we did white kindergartners. And in every subsequent year since then, this trend has held constant. We've enrolled more non-white first graders, kindergartens, first graders, second graders, kindergartens. So we're at the point now we're seeing the significant shift in the racial demographics of our country. We've never seen this kind of shift before, where now demographers are saying that at the current trends we're at as a nation in public schools across the United States of America, in 2030, which is a brief 6 years from now, what we will see is a nation that looks completely different than what we saw just 50 years ago. We will see that the largest subgroup of students in our country will no longer be white students, but they'll be Latinx students. The second largest group will be white students, but they'll go from being 80% of the student population in 1970 down to 30% in the year 2030. That's a significant decrease. And you see the rest of the groups here. About 20% of all students will be immigrants, and that number is expected to increase. So again, that means we have to understand culture, language, because it matters. About 10% of our students will be Black, 10% will be Asian American or Asian Pacific Islander, 5% will be mixed race. The mixed race population, meaning students who have parents who come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, is one of the fastest growing groups in our country. And about 1% will be Native Americans. So part of what I want us to recognize when I talk about equity now is that we need to understand that we are in the midst of a significant shift in who our students are. And so what we have to be mindful of is that as we talk about the nation's schools, we are also talking about what the nation will look like in years to come. So as you look at this right-hand column in terms of what the makeup of the nation's schools will look like, you're also looking at what the nation will look like in about another 16 years. By 2042, demographers say that the nation, not young people, but the entire nation will look very similar to what we see on that right side. So we're changing as a nation. I think that diversity, racial, ethnic, cultural, linguistic is something we should be proud of. It's something we should celebrate. It's something we should honor. It's something we should all want to learn more about. But the reality is, folks, is that if I'm being honest with you, that when people see these changes on the right side, it scares the living daylights out of them. And I say that what we need to be mindful of is that it's not a matter of if you will see these demographics in your district, your county, your state. It's a matter of when you will see them, because these demographics are happening rapidly, right? Now, I know someone might be looking at this and say, wait a minute, I'm adding this up, Dr. Howard, and that 20%, that adds up to more than 100%. And what I ask you to think about is that 20% immigrant population cuts across all those different ethnic groups. You can have Latinx immigrant students, white immigrant students, Black and Asian. So take out the 20% of immigrants and you should get close to 100%. So we are becoming a very diverse nation. And if I really had time today, which I don't, I would say that if you look at almost every academic index, what is deeply troubling, be it graduation rates, reading proficiency, math proficiency, writing proficiency, science proficiency, the groups who continue to lag behind are going to soon be our largest groups: Latinx students, immigrant students, Black students, mixed race students, Native American students. So when we talk about brave space conversations, the conversation we need to start with is, why do we see the same groups who have historically been denied access to opportunity being so far behind now? And they're no longer going to be just 20% of our population. They're soon to be 70, 80% of our population. That's why we have to have this hard conversation, because we're changing. Now, we're changing at a time when student diversity is really robust and rich. However, if I told you, let's take a look at our teaching population, you would see a very different story. And someone has already put this in the chat. Thank you, Verota Johnson, because the bottom line is when we look at our teaching population, we see something quite different. What do we see? We see, according to the data from the U.S. Department of Education that came out just last year, in the year 21, 22, approximately 84% of our classroom teachers are white, 8% are African-American, 6% Latino, Latinx, or Hispanic, 2% Asian American, 1% Native American. So we see a significant inverse of the makeup of who is being taught and who does the teaching. For us not to have this conversation would be an example of staying in the safe space mode I talked about earlier. Moreover, what we also know is in that same academic year, 21, 22, we had a third of our schools that did not have a single, not one teacher of color. Let's just say at the bottom, you may not be able to see that. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what does it mean when you have a significantly diverse student population being taught by a largely racially homogeneous teaching population? And oh, by the way, I should add that the numbers tell us that the numbers of white teachers in this country is increasing, that some estimates put it close to 90% in the next 7 years. So that's a larger conversation about why we have so few teachers of color. But part of what I need us to understand is that we need to help figure out how we help a largely white middle-class women population educate a largely increasingly immigrant student population that comes from many of whom come from low-income backgrounds. That's the elephant in the room. That's the conversation we have to have. That's why equity matters now, because if we don't have this conversation, we are overlooking the very reality that we will see teachers who are very well intended. Please hear me out when I say this. Very well intended, but who just oftentimes have a fundamental disconnect in understanding their students' ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of thinking, ways of expression, ways of learning. So we have to help increase the knowledge base of all teachers. And let me be clear, I'm not just talking white teachers, because oftentimes there are teachers of color who also don't have the cultural competence and don't have the racial literacies to best serve today's students. So this is across the board, but obviously the big focus gets placed on white teachers because they make up the overwhelming majority of our teachers in schools. That's why we need equity now, because we have to find ways to bridge these gaps and bridge these divides. What I can't do is have you leave this conversation thinking, okay, so is he saying that white teachers can't teach kids of color? Absolutely not. I see some phenomenal examples of white teachers who do phenomenal work with kids of color every single day. I also see some phenomenal teachers of color who do phenomenal work with all students across the board, students of color and white students every single day. But I also see white teachers who do damage and do harm to students of color, and we need to call it out. And not call it out to embarrass or belittle people, but call it out so we can help people be better. Call it out so we can begin to pull, like I said, call people in and not push them away. And we also have to recognize that there are teachers of color who also do harm to children of color. And we need to call that out as well. We need to call them in and say, how can we be better? That's why we need equity now. We need to have hard, what I call brave space conversations that then is informed by practice and policy that helps to improve the outcomes for all students, but especially those that have been historically on the margins. I hope you all with me on this, okay? So how do we do this? And what does the book come into play for this? The book is anchored on these three ideas around justice, around repair, tied to harm, and belonging. And I start off with justice because justice is one of these things that I think is so vital to how we should all try to live. And in the book, I talk about the fact that my mother would oftentimes tell my brother and I that she just wanted us to treat people the right way. Treat people the way that you would want to be treated, she always told us. That was the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So when I think about justice in the context of education, I ask all of the adults who do this work is, are we doing the right thing on behalf of all students in our schools? And I say that because to me, that should be the baseline. That should be the starting point. That should be the very sort of beginning of how we think about this work around equities. Are we doing the right thing on behalf of all students? Because the reality is this, and it pains me to say it, but I told you we're having brave space conversations. In brave space conversations, and I know there are folks who are out there who would agree with me, or many, I think you would agree with me, is that there are students who show up at schools every day that we're not doing right by. There are poor kids who get written off because they grow up in low-income backgrounds. There are immigrant students who get dismissed and who don't have the same kind of care and love and support from educators because of the fact that they're not born in this country. There are Black and brown children who oftentimes have lower expectations of them than are had for students who are not Black and brown in this country. There are students who have disabilities who oftentimes have their disabilities misunderstood in ways that cause more harm than good. So if I'm just being honest with us, the reality is that justice says, how do we start doing what is right for all students, recognizing each student's humanity in a way that informs our thoughts and our actions and our everyday practice? What is the right thing to do? That's what we should be asking every single day. Every practice should be evidence based on, is this what is right for all of our students? The bail schedule, the discipline policy, the reading program, the after-school access to the after-school program, extracurricular involvement. is this the right thing to do? And if you want to know if it's the right thing to do, my thing is one of the most brilliant things you can do, ask your students, because students are keen, and I do mean keen, on justice. Students will watch and listen and observe and learn and watch. How come this student got complimented 3 different times and I said the same answer, but I didn't get any affirmation? How come this student was able to get 3 chances before they got sort of their act together, but the first time I couldn't get mine together, I got sent to the principal's office? Students, I maintain, are some of our biggest arbiters of justice. They watch, they listen, they learn, and they will tell you if we're doing the right thing by all of our students. They listen, they learn, they take note. So justice is a big part of how we should think about this. The second pillar in this is really around harm and repair. And this one is kind of, difficult to grasp, because I maintain that what we have to recognize in this moment is that there are a lot of young people who are in our schools who are dealing with the effects of lots of psychological, social, and emotional harm that's been done to them by adults. Pains me to say that, but again, I told you we were going to have brave space conversation. I'll say it again. There are lots of young people in schools who are dealing with the consequences of the aftermath of harm that was done to them by adults. That harm sometimes happens before they even step foot in our classrooms, sadly enough. That harm happens sometimes before they step foot in our schools, sometimes, sadly enough. But sometimes it happens in classrooms. Sometimes it happens on the playground. Sometimes it happens in the hallways. And we don't recognize that our words as adults carry significant weight. So sometimes that harm is the ways in which our words have cut students down. Sometimes it's our looks that have cut students down. Sometimes it's tied to the ways in which we don't even give verbal affirmation. We don't smile at certain students, and that cuts them down. Sometimes it's the ways in which we oftentimes give the same opportunities to the same students over and over again, and we tell students essentially that they are rendered invisible. That's another form of harm. Sometimes we yell and we raise our voices in ways that are quite damaging to students and their fragile sense of self, and that causes harm. So I'm asking us to think about the ways in which we see young people in our schools every single day who are just dealing with so much hurt and so much harm. And I think it's up to us as educators to begin to think about ways that we are either A, helping to deepen that harm and hurt, or how we can begin to address that harm and hurt. And some of that harm can be short-term, some of it can be long-term. And part of what we have to understand is that sometimes you have students who walk into a classroom who are angry, who are upset, and all you say is good morning, and that student just blows his or her or their lid, and you're thinking, I just said good morning. I maintain that you don't recognize that sometimes you are paying the price for the 5, 6, 7 years prior that student dealt with harm from adults. And so you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You said the wrong thing to the wrong student. Students are walking around angry, upset, depressed, dealing with anxiety. I think we have to have a long, hard, brave space conversation about mental health in this country. I think the more we talk about mental health, we begin to recognize that it's okay to say, I'm not okay. And I maintain that we have to also be mindful of the way that we, the adults, are oftentimes struggling with our own hurt and harm, and how we know what we want or what we would like when it comes to repair. And do we give that same grace, that same justice to our students? So in the book, I give a number of examples of how we can begin to recognize that harm and recognize that hurt. So when students are behind academically, we don't automatically chalk that up to students being lazy or not working hard or not being motivated, but we get to root causes. Why is the student behind? Why is the student constantly falling asleep in my classroom? Why is the student not able to keep on task? Harm means we give students the opportunity to be human. And we don't ask what's wrong to that student. We ask a different question. We ask what may have happened to that student. And I think that changes the framing in such a way that allows us to think about the relationships we have with students, the expectations we have with students, how much we know about students beyond the classroom. All these factors are part of how we begin to think about harm and repair. The words that we speak carry significant weight. As adults in a school context, we can either lift up the aspirations, the joy, and the excitement a student has about learning, or we can do just the opposite. So I want everyone to recognize that sometimes remembering a student's name is a sign of repair. Sometimes speaking to a student in his or her native language is a sign of repair. It affirms them, right? Sometimes asking a student about their weekend is a sign of repair because it shows you care and you remember that I was having a birthday party this weekend. The little acts that we all can take, whether it be a principal, a school board member with a policy, a teacher in his or her their classroom, can take steps to repair. Now, I say that because at the end of the day, when you begin to recognize what harm does and what hurt is and how we repair, then it moves us to this final template. Oh, I went through this one already, right? Which is, put that slide in there twice, which is the one around belonging. And that's what we ultimately want to create with equity. How do we create the schools? How do we create classrooms where all students feel like they are seen, valued, heard, respected, validated? I'm not being treated differently because of my zip code. I'm not being seen differently because of my skin color. I'm not being seen as being less than because of my gender identity. I'm not looked at as being worthy of being dismissed because of my sexual orientation. I'm not being frowned upon because my parents are in the same sex union. All these are reasons why students oftentimes feel like they don't belong, right? My religion is not understood, right? All these different ways in which students look. So much of school is not just about the academic part, but school is just as much a social aspect as well. And the more that students feel like they belong, the more that they feel like they're connected, the more they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, you increase the likelihood that you can improve outcomes. So that's why we talk about the ways in which we have to have brave space conversations to begin to ask, what does it mean to be the lone Black child in a school that's mostly non-Black? And you're oftentimes rendered invisible or you're not seen. What does it mean if you're the only Muslim student who's at a school where there's very few Muslim students who are there and you're constantly being made fun of because of your dress or because of your ways of worshiping? What does it mean if you're a kid who's bused from a low-income community to a more affluent area and kids make fun of you because you don't have the kind of expensive clothes and expensive attire that some other kids? I could go on and on and on, but you know who those kids are. I maintain that this is why the relationship piece matters, because if you begin to see who are the kids who are oftentimes the most disruptive, as we call them, or the most difficult, as we call them, it's oftentimes because there aren't enough connections with them and those adults. So in the book, I give a number of examples of how we can connect, how we belong, steps that we can take at the policy level, because sometimes our policies are harmful. We have policies in our districts that say we have back to school night at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm sorry, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that means you have a lot of parents that you're inviting in while you're excluding a host of other parents who work and can't get to back to school at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Maybe we need to rethink the policy. Or school discipline policies that we have that are centered around the fact that if students are insubordinate, that becomes a reason for why we suspend students, when there's a whole lot of evidence that suggests that insubordination is highly subjective, and yet the policy is oftentimes used to harm some kids over others. And throughout the book, I give a number of examples of what that can look like and how we create more belonging, more just, more healing schools. So you might ask, who is this book for? And I tried to be as intentional as I could when I thought about this, because I want all hands on deck. I'll say it again. Part of what I think about with equity is everybody can play a role. We know that there are disparities. We know that there are disadvantages, but my ask of you, so what are you going to do about it? And everybody should be asking, what can I do about it? And everybody on this call, I would imagine you are doing something about it now because you show up. So the book is for practitioners who show up 180 days a year to be there for other people's children, designing lessons, putting together units. When you're tired and you're at your wit's end, you still show up and give every fiber of your being to try to be the best educator you can be. For school building leaders who show up early, who stay late, who think about the work on weekends, there's something that you can do in terms of how you think about how you best support your teachers, how you best support your school community, how you best support your parents and caregivers, right? We see all this data that school leaders consistently put in 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week to do this work. This is for school reform advocates, folks who think about these issues, talk about these issues, but at the end of the day are oftentimes looking for ideals, strategies. And in the book, I have a lot of different strategies, and I'll talk about those in a minute. I'm also big on leadership, school board members, district leaders, because oftentimes equity starts at the top, the folks who have the decision to set the tone and send the messages to folks about what matters, you have the ability to really move the needle because you can say, this is who we are and this is what we stand for. Parents and caregivers, there's a chapter here for you in terms of what you should know, your rights, your roles, your responsibilities, in terms of how you can create better partnership with schools, steps you can take to help support students and loved ones at home in their academic trajectory. And I think it's just for anyone who are what I consider concerned educators as ways to help move the needle to make sure that all students are able to do well. And I maintain students can read this. I want students, high school, middle school students to read this and say, is this what we need? Is this what we want? So the book is for everyone. Everyone in this work can find themselves somewhere in this work because we need all hands on deck. That question again is, so what are you going to do about making your school community better? And as you go through the book, I was big on making sure that there are strategies and practical steps in each chapter that are connected to the notions of justice, repair, and belonging. So what does it mean for me as a classroom to think about, for a classroom teacher to think about justice? What does it mean for me as a school leader to think about repair? What does it mean for me as someone who works at the district to think about what belonging is? And so each chapter I give strategies and steps of what you can do in terms of finding names of community-based organizations if you're a school district trying to find ways to support students. How do we find wraparound services for students who might need medical, vision, dental supports, but don't have access to them, right? How do we think about language in a curriculum that does not always talk about home as being somehow different from what other students think about home? We talk about youth who are in foster care or youth who are experiencing homelessness as ways in which we kind of engage them. Belonging is the very point someone just dropped in the chat about thinking about Maslow before Bloom. So in each chapter, you see a series of different ways of how can I think about being more justice-centered? How can I focus on repair if I'm a classroom teacher teaching third graders? How can I think about belonging if I'm teaching students who have special needs, and so on and so forth? And what I want teachers to do in particular, what I want leaders to do is to create professional learning communities, to talk and think and build, and strategize about these different topics. At the end of each chapter, what you'll find are questions to consider. And these questions can essentially be the impetus for your own learning as a school community, because I recognize that not all schools are the same. And what school A might be dealing with is very different than what school B is dealing with. And so that's why equity is going to look very different from context to context. But I ask questions that you can consider. How would you describe the culture of my school or district? How does my school or district respond to matters tied to hate speech? And that's one of the big topics we talk about in the book, that hate speech happens across so many different levels. Hate speech based on one's gender, hate speech based on someone's skin color, based on someone's accent. I can go on and on. How do we deal with that? So we have questions that can be used in your professional learning community to help you think about ways in which you establish norms, codes of conduct, et cetera, et cetera. And then what I also have done is I provide deeper resources with additional reading. Each chapter at the end of it has questions to consider. And it also has recommendations for additional reading and resources. So you have a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of information that you can use to figure out issues around trauma, issues around supporting students with special needs, how to support parents and caregivers, issues tied to psychological, social, emotional well-being. You name it, the goal is here to find a lane for everyone to be involved in the work of helping to support our students. I say all this because I think at the end of the day, we just cannot afford to wait, folks. We cannot wait. We learned from the pandemic that when it comes to our students missing out from core opportunities to learn, that they will spend, in some cases, a lifetime trying to catch up. We have to be better. We need to be more committed. We have to be able to help all students in this work. Let me be clear, all students should be our priority, but I maintain, and I say this throughout, that equity is about being more intentional and being unapologetically bold in saying that we're gonna also focus on those who have historically been marginalized. And you know who those students are, because every student has them. I mean, every school has them. And so that's what this work is about. Again, it may not make you popular at times. It may not make you the most well-liked person at time, but it will make you the person who is willing to push the envelope to say, I'm here for children. I'm here for students. And many of you on this call, right now as I speak, you're already the person who has the label of being the troublemaker. You're already the person who's labeled as the one who raises questions that folks don't want to talk about. You're already labeled as the person who comes in and just upsets the apple cart. My thing is just turn that apple cart over. Keep being that person, because you do this because you know that schools can be better and that there are some students and sometimes families that we're not serving well. So this is the call in. This is the call in to ask all of our folks who do this work to be bold, to be courageous, to be brave, and to put students first. but to put students first in a manner that's going to be equity centered, and so that we can make sure that when we look back 5, 10 years from now, we see that we're in a much better place than we are today. So with that being said, I want to stop and see if we can have some question and answer. I've covered a lot of ground that's tied to justice, harmony, and belonging. And I will stop right there. Is that good?
Thanks so much, Tyrone. Yeah, that was great. We do have a couple of questions looking through the chat. The first one is from Shauna Schroeder, and she said, "Thank you for your understanding of our special needs students' needs. Could you touch on the support teachers can receive for the day-to-day situations that are so heartbreaking? I often go home in tears for the situations my students are put in before they come to me each day. It's emotionally exhausting, and I think we need support as teachers."
Yeah, you said it best there. Thank you for that question, because I spend time in schools, a lot of time in schools, and I think that one of the big populations that we overlook are students with special needs. And then in chapter 2, I talk about this with more detail. The fact that we have legislation that says we're supposed to provide certain types of supports for our students with disabilities. Yet I go to schools and I don't see those supports in place. And I see schools that are woefully understaffed when it comes to their students with special needs, students with disabilities. I see teachers who are at their breaking point because they are doing everything in their power to give students so much, but yet they don't feel supported. And so this is a wake-up call for districts. This is a wake-up call for our school leadership to say, why do we give some of our, again, most vulnerable populations, in this case, we're talking about students with special needs, why do we give the students who need so much so little? And so I think that we have to be willing to kind of sort of use our megaphone and bring attention to these issues, because I think most folks in our state capitals either don't know or they don't care. And I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say they just don't know, because I want to believe if they knew, they would care. But in the book, I give some strategies on how we can be more thoughtful about creating inclusive classroom spaces, least restrictive environments, and being mindful of the fact that students with special needs have tremendous potentials to learn, are incredibly brilliant, have intellect that is oftentimes unmatched and uncanny, but yet we just don't see them that way, and how we have to be better in terms of our expectations, our perceptions, but also our supports for them, their families, and for their teachers.
Thank you. Okay, the next question we have is based off of a comment Beverly Dawn made about these kids' mentalities, and just thinking about that a little bit more. I think that some people have a question afterwards, is like, how can teachers combat these kids' mentality among their fellow educators when it comes to supporting students from undeserved populations?
Yeah, so again, I always tell educators we've got to step back for a moment and remember we're the adults here. So when we talk about the students' mentalities, we have to recognize that students oftentimes give what they've gotten. And what I mean by that is that this is there are certain teachers at certain schools, at every school, there's teachers who students would never talk to in a particular manner, who they would never disrespect. They would never say anything inappropriate to them, because those teachers have established relationships, caring relationships. They know how to connect. They've taken time to meet with those students one-on-one. They have a rapport with them that makes them really kind of feel like they are at one with them. Whereas other students don't have those same relationships with adults. And so the ways in which students behave oftentimes is tied to the ways that adults have invested in them. And even when that's not the case, what I also ask us to realize that there's this saying that we all are familiar with, that hurt people hurt people. I think that issues of trauma are very real. We have students, when you deal with poverty, or you deal with stress, or you deal with anxiety, students oftentimes behave in ways that are just completely irrational. Yet we as the adults, we cannot take that behavior personally, because oftentimes there's a root cause as to why that's happening. And I maintain we have to understand that, again, hurt people hurt people. If I have been neglected, if I have been emotionally abused, if I know I'm behind academically, if I know teachers never say anything complimentary about me, I am walking around bitter, angry, upset, and it manifests in a host of different ways. So I maintain we have to try to understand root causes of behavior. And once we understand root causes of behavior, we can take some steps and strategies. And I talk a lot about it in the book about relationship building. It's a big part of what I try to lift up in chapter 4, is that can be a step that we take. But then at the same time, I want to be frank with you. I'm about brave spaces. There's some students who need interventions that have not occurred yet. We just have to be upfront about that and recognize that if we don't get the proper supports that certain students need, we're doing them a disservice.
Thank you. We have another one. We have to find ways, Tracy just commented on that. We have to find ways to connect with our students once they know we sincerely care, a change can happen.
Yeah, Tracy's spot on about that. I'll just say this real quick on that one before you go to another one, Morgan.
Yeah.
Look, I cite a couple studies that have looked at students' perspectives and opinions about when they learn best. I was involved in one study about 7, 8 years ago. We asked students kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. When you learned and you were at your best academically, what was the number one ingredient that was at play? Overwhelmingly, the students said having a caring teacher. Caring teachers matter. You make a big difference.
Okay, and then one other question based on some of the comments in the chat. How can administrators leverage the voices of students, their families, and their communities when trying to advocate for better care, instruction, access, or resources for their schools?
That's a great question. I in the book, I put a lot of responsibility on administrators because I think educators are oftentimes as strong or as limited as their leadership is. And so I think administrators have to be willing to say, I want to hear where we have fallen short as a school. And I think administrators have to be willing to sit in that hot seat and hear the anger, have to hear some of the criticism, have to hear some of the pent-up frustration that parents have had for years, right? I think you have to open yourself up to say, I want to do better. We want to do better. And I need to hear from you. I need to know what you want, what you need. But then you have to take those recommendations and suggestions, leaders, and then you have to ask those same parents and use those same voices to show up at school board meetings. I make a big call that school board meetings are places where lots of decisions get made, but yet there are oftentimes so few people at them. School board meetings is where you get the opportunity to see how certain people vote on certain issues, where funding goes, where programs get cut, what policies are lifted up. And so I think that administrators have to ask those particular school leaders, have to ask those parents and caregivers to show up at a school board meeting. If you get just a dozen parents to show up, that will get the attention of folks to begin to say, what's going on here? Because typically they don't have many folks who show up. I maintain that parents have to recognize the power that they have, the voices that they have, and the ways in which you can put pressure on the decision makers, on the power brokers in your county, in your district, in your city, to say these are the changes that we want to see. And it's not just showing up once. Change that we really want to see happen means you may have to show up week after week, meeting after meeting, meeting after meeting to finally get the kind of movement that you want to see. But there's power in numbers. So my response is to ask administrators to be more willing to listen, to hear, to learn, but then to act by bringing those things to the table, showing up at school board meetings and trying to work in conjunction with your parents and caregivers, not working against them to try to figure out what's in the best interest of your students. But very good question.
Piggybacking off of that, is that how you would suggest to strengthen the school-home connection, or is there anything else?
Yeah, I think the school-home connection, I talk about this a lot. The school-home connection is rooted in the fact that we have to understand this sad reality. That there are many parents who feel like they were harmed by schools when they were younger. So they see schools as distrusting places. They see school personnel as people that they should not trust. They see the school as being sort of indicative or sort of representative or symbolic of this place that created really unhappy times for them. So they will tell their kids that these schools are not places that are going to be always sort of comforting to you. So I think the way you begin to build those bridges is you send notices home to your parents and caregivers and say, you know what, today was a great day. I had to interact with your son. He's amazing. I appreciate your daughter being on time for my class every day this week. Sometimes we have to turn the tide and set a new tone by saying some of the positive things that have happened with home. Schools oftentimes only reach out to home when there's something negative, when there's something bad. And I think you have to turn the tide, let parents know that you're just grateful the fact that, you know, you're really supporting me at home with what you're doing with your student. And it makes my job much easier. We also have to listen to parents and hear their concerns about what they want for their children. But again, it takes time. We have to understand this is about the relationship building, the rapport building, and it doesn't happen overnight. You can't try one thing. And again, remember, what you do for one group of parents might look differently than for another set of parents. That's the equity approach again. But I think we have to be willing to reach out to parents. I think language is important, making sure we're sending home communication in as many languages as possible. So that way, all parents and caregivers are feeling respected and seen and valued. And I also am very intentional about talking about parents and caregivers. Why do I say that? Because I think we also have to recognize that not all of our students are being raised by their biological parents. There's a report that just came out from the U.S. Census Bureau just last week that showed that we have close to 7 million grandparents who are raising grandchildren. 7 million. So that means that you are very likely to see students who are being raised by grandparents. I met a woman in Chicago 2 years ago. I'll never forget. She was 94 years old, raising her great-great-great-grandchildren. So when we talk about caregivers, they are not just biological parents, but they're grandparents. Sometimes they're foster parents. Sometimes they're older brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, cousins. So understand the dynamic nature of families and then be able to respond in kind. But yes, this is an important part of the work of equity. We have to be able to connect with families better. And we have to recognize the harm that schools have done to lots of families and try to take a step in helping to address some of those harms.
Thank you. The last question that we have here, we've got about 3 or 4 more minutes. How can we call in members of administration who are causing harm?
Woo, man, we need a whole webinar for that one.
Yeah.
That's a real question. And it really happens, and it happens a lot. And this is where I think we have to be very careful, because it would be irresponsible for me to sit here and tell a teacher or teachers, you need to go in and tell your principal X, Y, and Z. That creates a very difficult and hostile work environment for you potentially. But I do think you have to recognize the power that comes from parents and caregivers. And this is where I think we have to ask ourselves first, have we tried to have conversations with our leaders? Individually or collectively, to say, here are the concerns we have, and then offer solutions. I think oftentimes for many leaders, they hear complaint, but no potential solutions. Offer us potential solutions, because that can be a big part of helping us to get better. But then even at that point in time, there are leaders who are just sort of set in their ways on how things have always been done. And I maintain that there's power in numbers. You have to work in conjunction with your parents and caregivers. You have to work with others in your school community who share your views on what is not happening in the school. And I'm also big on accountability. What do I mean by that? That means we have to sometimes go through the hierarchy. We have to write emails to school board members. We have to be willing to meet with the superintendent. We have to talk to people who the principal reports to and begin to articulate what our concerns are. Document what happens, when it happened, who it happened to, why it happened. And I think we have to sort of frame this, and not this being about personal attacks, but sometimes we just have leaders who are not moving us in the direction that we want to move. And again, what's the saying? The squeaky wheel gets the grease. I have found over the years that sometimes it's those parent groups, those teacher groups who really kind of come together and say, we think that we can do better, who frequently get what they want.
Again, Tyrone, thank you very much for this time to spend with you and to learn from you, and hope everybody has a good week.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining.